Chapter 8, page 37. Daniel sat back and took a sip of his rainwater tea. The rain was beginning to let up. When it was clear enough, he would try again to pick up the boys' track again. Strangely, Brandon, Troy, and Scotty had left the river and cut across the mountain. Their tracks had led him over the tops of two ridges. There was no telling how far they had gone before the rain had hit. He felt edgy. The newspaper was full of stories about backpackers who had lost their way up here. The Premonition Mountains were famous for catching inexperienced hikers unaware. Daniel had never hiked up here. He didn't know these mountains at all. But thanks to the time he had spent with his uncle, he knew there was little chance of his losing his way. He wished he could say the same for Brandon and the others. What are they doing? In the direction they were going, they would never cut across the bridge road. The air was cool, but he was anxious to get started. Taking handfuls of dirt, he doused the little fire. He knew it would be next to impossible to find any tracks after the rain. The best he could hope for was that the boys would continue in the same direction and break off branches here and there, leaving a trail that he could follow. It was slow going. He circled and circled, hoping to find some sign of where they had gone. The noise he was making startled an old doe. She jumped out in front of him and bounded away. Daniel smiled. Some backwoodsman, I'm louder than a herd of buffalo. The doe drew his attention to some brush off to his right. The bushes had been trampled recently and hadn't had a chance to recover. Daniel pushed some of them aside. Under one was the clear imprint of a tennis shoe, now filled with muddy water. He looked in the direction the boys appeared to be heading. It didn't make sense. Why would they try to cross the Premonitions? Unless they were lost. If they were, it would make his job even harder. They could change direction at any time. Daniel wondered if he had made a mistake. Maybe it would have been better for him to cross the river and get help instead of wandering around up here. He cupped his hands and yelled for the others. There was no answer. He decided to keep going. If he lost their trail now, he might never be able to find them. When the van didn't show up at Camp Eagle Nest, he figured they'd send out search parties. A lot would depend on how wide an area they covered. The searchers wouldn't be able to spot the van at all now. On his trip downriver, he had discovered that it had completely sunk below the surface. Anyway, he doubted if a search party would think to look on this side of the mountain range. The more he thought about it, the more he was convinced that the driver had taken them close to 100 miles in the wrong direction. Daniel worked the area carefully. He cut their trail again near an ancient pine tree. The dirt and pine needles under the tree had been packed down. He studied the place where the three boys had waited out in the rain and scratched his head. The tree was on the wrong side of a small ravine. They had been sitting facing the wind as it drove the heavy rain in on them. To stay dry, all they would have had to do was move to a tree on the other side of the ravine, or move around to the other side of this tree. These guys are worse off than I thought. They don't even have enough sense to come in out of the rain. From the tree, the tracking became easier. The boys had walked in the mud and left a good, clean trail. Daniel followed it up a rocky slope. From there, they had taken a 90-degree turn and moved parallel with a rock cliff. Daniel paused at the top of the cliff and looked out. Below him was a sheer drop. In front of him were miles and miles of forest. It was a forbidding sight. The possible urgency of the boys' situation jarred him back to reality. It was getting late, and he still hadn't been able to catch up with them, which meant they would probably spend a cold, sleepless night without food or water. Part of him felt as if they deserved it, but another part remembered the way Brandon had defended him in the van, and the look on Troy's face when he tried to thank Daniel for saving his life. He kept going.